Hello and welcome to this online roundtable about 5G in Belgium. The Belgian National Security Council has proposed a new law which includes a series of additional security measures regarding the rollout of 5G mobile networks. And the capability of 5G is immense and will affect every area of the economy. And therefore, every government has a duty to ensure that any deployed 5G technology is safe to use as a communications medium by its citizens and by its government agencies. Well, with me to discuss this issue are Professor George Ataya, who is Academic Director of Solvay Business School and in charge of information security. He's also Managing Partner of Ataya Partners. Also Mike Parr of PWR Limited, specialising in networks research. Shannon Brandauer, who is an attorney and describes herself as a China watcher and specialises in European and international business law. Raquel Ricard, a Fulbright Fellowship specialising in public policy strategy and the governance of technology. And finally, Yvan Desmedt, a lawyer specialising in competition and telecom law. Thank you very much all for taking part. Let me start by asking each one of you in turn for your views on the rollout of 5G in Belgium. And if we could start, please, with you, George. What's your opinion?
Well, I think it is something that is, on one hand, important. We certainly have a lot of reaction. When I talk to my wife, she doesn't want to hear about that. But when I talk about my fellow experts in cybersecurity and protection of information, we hear a lot of, again, reactions that are pro or cons, depending on the knowledge that anybody has on the topic. So I think it's an issue that is worth debating on one hand, and is certainly also worth understanding the ins and outs of the security aspects of it.
What are the security risks, Mike?
Well, actually, I was going to ask everybody else exactly the same question. The articles that I read were filled with security without actually ever defining exactly what it is. Let me be slightly provocative here. I'm assuming that everybody is aware that as of now, the security services intercept most, if not all, mobile traffic. I've seen the kit that they use. It is a reality in every single country. I'm speculating and just wondering perhaps if Huawei were less than cooperative in terms of making aspects of the equipment available to the security services for interception purposes. Apologies for being controversial, but it is a fact that the security services want to intercept mobile traffic. So I'll be interested to hear the definition of security. Now, what do we mean by it? Is it to protect somebody from looking at, or to protect somebody that's using it to, I don't know, send a recipe to somebody else? I don't know. I've not seen a definition. I'd be interested to hear one. There we are.
Yvan, you're a lawyer. What would the law say is the definition of information security?
It's a very good question, because what we see in the regulatory proposals in particular that are being proposed now and which have been launched for consultation by the BIPT, they do provide for the criteria for how you have to qualify, what would qualify as what is referred to as a high-risk vendor. But you actually see that the criteria which are being proposed are extremely vague and leave a huge margin of discretion to the government. And that is, I think, a real concern to us, because that margin of discretion is, first of all, leads to unpredictability and absence of legal certainty. And it also means that your ability to subsequently put the governmental decision to judicial scrutiny is something which is going to be very difficult. So it is that concept of national security concern is a little bit like a jolly that is being played now, and which may also be used for, in a broader fashion in the context of, tensions on trade relationships and others, to advocate also, or to push behind that argument of national security, some other agenda points which are more protectionist of nature, which would really be a shift in the way in which the policy, the telecommunications industry has evolved since the liberalization over the last 20 years.
I'm an American attorney, and I've been following Huawei's struggles across the jurisdictions. I've been following them in the US, in Canada, in the UK, and in various member states, as well as at the EU level. The US, for its part, fears that Huawei equipment, or at least the government of China in Beijing, could use Huawei equipment to gather intelligence, to steal trade secrets, to track down and punish dissidents, and to even go so far as to bring down entire networks to incapacitate other nations in times of crisis. There's a very, very good report that was done by, and I'm not going to pronounce his name correctly, but it's Tim Röhlig, and he's out of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. He did a report that was presented, I think, to the Commission at the EU level, and he talks about what he sees are the risks to the EU. In his opinion, the problem is who controls Huawei, and I think that's the name of his report, who controls Huawei. And it is of course a security issue, but it's also this gray, murky area of we can't know for certain whether Beijing is pulling the levers or Ren Zhengfei, the founder of Huawei, is calling the shots. In his opinion, if you want the report, I can send it to you later, but it's easy to find on Google. Again, the name is Who Controls Huawei. In his opinion, it's really hard to make an argument that Huawei is independent from the Chinese government. There are several.
Okay,
Yeah.
but I understand what you're saying, but is it not a case that Huawei submitted their codes to the National Cyber Security Centre in the UK, who found no evidence of backdoors? They did find some maybe sloppy engineering, but no evidence of backdoors at all, and no malign intention. Is this not perhaps more of a tool in a trade war between the USA and China rather than a real security issue? George, do you have a view?
Well, in my opinion, you probably know I'm involved in governance of information security for a while, and beyond the political aspect, for which I frankly know nothing, I think we have to look at what is our objective from what we talk about in relation to security. Security ensures that we have, we guarantee confidentiality, integrity, availability, non-repudiation, etc., etc. What is important for us is the national security. There are specific objectives on how to protect national security, which means no backdoors, no eavesdropping, etc., etc. Now, there are series of business objectives or nationwide security objective that I just mentioned, no backdoor, no eavesdropping, etc. And we can specify those, we can list and inventory those. And for each one of those, we can try to get a positive assurance. And this is the way we act, the security professionals, which means that we identify what is the risk, what are within the architecture that we have, whether it is business-related architecture, application architecture, technology architecture, whatever, what is in that landscape, what would be the potential risks, and for each one of those risks, identify what are the affirmative actions that we have to do to validate, verify how much that risk could exist, must exist, or and if it exists, how much it is serious, how much the impact can be great. And based on that kind of assessment, we can at the end of the day say, yes, there is an issue, no, there is no issue, or this is a vague situation. For the risk number 2.3, there is something that could be a major issue that we have to address. Then we could focus all our attention on that risk and not on naming or titles that are high risk vendor or a percentage of use or whatever. I think those are methods that were put in place. I mean, those new denominations that I was not aware of are put in place in order to avoid doing the hard work, which is to be done anyhow.
George,
Right.
if I may just pick up on this for 1 minute, because I think what you're saying is exactly the problem that we face with the proposal that is put on the table for the Belgian measure, which is kind of putting it upside down. So it is targeting what is referred to as a high risk vendor, but without doing what should be done is really kind of this bottom up approach, is to start with the risks and then identify the measures what you should be taking. And the risks require a complete, understanding of how the networks are going to work and where the potential cybersecurity risks lie within the network. And that is not what is on the table now for the 5G restrictions in Belgium.
Raquel, can I just ask you about what are the public policy issues relating to this question? Would you have a view?
Yes, so actually, additionally to all your points, so one of the main problems with this is that when you look at the European Union's 5G toolbox, you realize that if you want to define, for example, a country of origin, one of the main challenges and one of the main needs for all EU member states is the fact that all of them implement the same standards. So for example, we see that, for example, in the case of France decided to roll out the 5G systems and network providers, concretely the case of Huawei. And then, for example, we have the case of Germany, which is still trying to decide on whether Huawei or, let's say, 5G suppliers, generally speaking, they are either an economic challenge or a national security issue. And for example, still we have, for example, the case of Spain, which decided to reduce the Huawei kit for core 5G networks, but still it's maintaining the peripheral radio equipment. So we have several cases, and one of the main problems, in going down to the case of Belgium, is the fact that each country hasn't defined the same criteria of what risk means and what security risk means, but especially the fact that no country is harmonizing its own standards with its peers within the European Union. And in my perspective, this should lead to a stronger centralization of policies at the EU umbrella if the European Union wants to do this properly.
But wasn't this exactly what the EU 5G toolbox was supposed to address? And yet the BIPT report seems to drift away from that and goes even further. I mean, could this lack of harmonization at EU level hurt EU countries?
So how to say it? Well, I think that in the case of the European Union, there are two levels of policy management. The first level is when the European Union is delivering directives and regulations that all member states need to comply with and need to translate into its own particularities. And the second level is when each country has its own competencies to apply the rest of, let's say, telecom issues that pertain to the national competence level. I don't see that harmonization is not appropriate. Actually, I think that harmonization is the starting point to try to leverage the European Union's so-called objective of technological sovereignty. And actually, in that point, for the European Union, it will be very important to try to harmonize the standards with regard to 5G suppliers, especially because now with the incoming Biden administration, the European Union and the US both have an opportunity to reestablish that transatlantic agenda that existed and that actually now exists still, but it has been a bit, let's say, slowed down or disrupted in some concrete areas. So even when looking at the case of Belgium, which is the host country for NATO and for other international organizations which pertain to the area of the transatlantic agenda between the US and European Union in security, it will be, even for Belgium as such, highly important to harmonize standards with the rest of countries. But still, as George said, national intelligence services are always one of the first stakeholders to analyze to what extent 5G suppliers represent a risk or a challenge or an opportunity. So
can I refer to, there are two phrases I keep hearing. One is trusted vendor, the other is high risk vendor. Now I'm assuming the trusted vendor are, the Western suppliers like Nokia and Ericsson, and high risk vendor are the Chinese companies. How useful is that definition, and does it provide any comfort to the operators trying to buy equipment and set up the networks? George?
Yeah, well, when we talk about high risk, it depends, again, what risk are we talking about? I mentioned initially the different domains of risk related to integrity, continuity, availability, and confidentiality. Now, we may have a very high risk vendor because the vendor is not capable of supporting and delivering its equipment on time. So we are talking then about availability risk. Now, if the whole country is relying on the same supplier, for example, we may have a high risk where whoever that supplier is. So we are talking about probably different things, grouping different criteria in one word. And I think it is, again, important to do, as you mentioned, as Yvan mentioned, the bottom-up approach, which is let us look at those different individual atomic potential risks. Some of them may be so important. We are talking here about national security. We are talking about the NIS directive. We are talking about so many things that are essential for Europe today that we cannot afford going into a vague kind of criteria that are probably having many holes and many logics that are not that could seem awkward, in my opinion.
Shannon, should the general citizen be really worried about national security here, or is it just an esoteric conversation?
So people don't know how old I am, but I'm old. And I've been paying attention to, and I won't tell people how old I am, thank you very much, but I've been paying attention to China for 25 years, close attention. And we are seeing an episode that is even unprecedented because of the technology available to China, or available in China. We are seeing a time in Chinese history that's unprecedented in terms of surveillance and control. Even Mao Zedong really ruled through his cult. Of course, he had the bureaucracy of the CCP, but he was nearly worshipped as a god. So it was just a different type of rule. Xi Jinping is not worshipped as a god. Xi Jinping rules as an authoritarian technocrat with an enormous surveillance apparatus. This is no secret. The Chinese government doesn't make it a secret. So yes, unfortunately, I would have to say that people inside China and people outside China should be concerned about the data protection risks. They should also be concerned about the human rights risks and the history of IP and trade secret theft that we're aware of that comes from China as well.
Mike, you talked about security services earlier. You clearly have knowledge. What's your opinion?
I guess there's two elements here, and I picked up the comment from Mrs. Brandau about gathering intelligence, and I guess you could split the let's call it the risk, which is still rather poorly defined, into two parts. And one is gathering information on people or companies, and using the equipment that's installed to do that. On the other hand, there is what has not been mentioned is critical infrastructure, and let's call it some risks that might be associated with that. Back in the 2000s, we did a study for a G7 country on critical infrastructure and its risks in Europe. And that was quite revealing in the sense that, sure, if you were dependent on your communications on mobile systems, then perhaps there was something of a risk. If, on the other hand, you've got dedicated hardwired communications, there's much less of a risk. I have a power background. I understand how power networks function. and generally speaking, they have their own dedicated networks, which tends to mean that the 5G is likely to be used for generalized communications between people and some things, probably not for communications for critical infrastructure, as I understand it. And I do accept the point about perhaps certain entities using access to the network to use it to collect information on individuals. But let me just ask, does everybody here have a loyalty card to their supermarket? I'm sure you all do. I think you know where I'm going with this. If I wanted to collect information on people, I'd just hack Carrefour's loyalty card system, or Delays, or all the others. There's a huge amount of information on people out there already, and therefore I think at an individual level, that particular horse has already bolted the stable.
I don't, but a majority of us put all our information freely available on Facebook anyway. I mean, why should we be worried if we're giving this information away?
Indeed. I think that the issue does come down to the ability to trace people and collect information on people. We have seen how the Chinese, in the case of, for example, wind turbines, undertook industrial espionage to steal secrets from American superconductor. That's on record. There's good history behind that case. I'm wondering what if you included Huawei, and I'm completely neutral on this. I'm just putting forward some points of view. If you said, okay, Huawei, sell the equipment, would there be some unintended consequences to that? I mean, there's strong points in terms of better competition, and there's weaker points in terms of would the equipment be used for unintended consequences. I really don't have a view on this. I am neutral, but history points to the equipment being used for all sorts of purposes.
Can I just move back? That's the equipment, but can I move back at the moment to the particular proposed Belgian telecom law and ask, how does it differentiate between anything we've seen in the past? Yvan, what's your view? Does it contain something that is different?
What is actually quite remarkable, and it goes back to your comment in relation to the EU approach, is the absence of a consistent approach between member states. So in that respect, yes, Belgium is different from what has been done in Sweden, what has been done in Germany, what has been done in other countries. But that is true for every single country, unfortunately, because of the way in which the European Union has approached this. Which is very different from the way in which they have generally approached the telecommunications industry, where particularly now with the communications code, they've really tried to give a big push to a harmonized approach. Where the Belgian proposal is in particular an outlier is in relation to the fact that they have this kind of top-down vendor approach instead of having a risk approach. Which we've already touched upon. Another peculiarity is that it is going to be the network operators that are going to have to request some sort of authorization license to work with certain vendors, and then we'll get the ministerial approval for the selected vendor. So in a sense, the assessment is going to concern the equipment manufacturer, but the ones that are going to be in the driver's seat are going to be the operators. So there is also a discrepancy there in terms of the procedural setup that is being proposed, which is also something which is quite specific to the Belgian system.
It's early December now. They've put it out to consultation by the end of December. I mean, if I was cynical, which I'm not, I'd say this is an attempt to, with Christmas and coronavirus, to stifle any real consultation. What's your view on that?
look, I think the reality is I think you're probably right. And the reality is that I do think that BIPT was very much in favor of a consultation and pushed for it also at political level. I know that other stakeholders within the government were not even considering a consultation. So in that respect, I think it's still a welcome step in terms of transparency. But I do agree with you that the weight which is going to be given to the comments in the context of that consultation is probably not to be overstated.
How important is a level playing field for suppliers and telecoms companies in this? I mean, it seems, is it true that the security issue is more important than anything else? I mean, who's going to pay for cutting out and reducing competition from the vendors? Clearly the user in the end. Is this right?
Can I speak on that?
Yeah.
These are issues that are obviously being discussed in the US as well. And I would refer you to an amazing report by the Center for American Progress that concludes that there is a solution to this issue of who's going to pay for it. And that is to find opportunity. Each country or jurisdiction or the European Union needs to find opportunity to boost their own national champions, if you will, to develop the industry, the telecommunications industries, so that there is more competition, so that there is less of a concern over prices. Because yes, you're exactly right. When you take out in my book, completely subsidized option from another government, you're left with an unsubsidized option that is going to be a great deal more expensive for everyone, the consumer, the suppliers, everyone. So that is a problem, though, that you're not going to get around just by using Huawei. This is something, telecommunications is such a strategic and critical part of infrastructure nowadays that it really is an issue. It's not really a can that you should be kicking down the road, if you understand what I'm saying. It's something that you should be dealing with and not just relying on an outside vendor for that anyway, or an outside party for that anyway. So that. What
about the cost of removing Huawei equipment and other dubious equipment and replacing it through existing networks? That must be a massive cost, and somebody's got to pay for that.
Yeah, I don't have the statistics or the numbers or the figures on all of that. I would assume so. I would assume it's very expensive. Yes.
George, you.
Yeah. Well, I think all those discussions are also very regular discussions that we have in the governance of information security, which is what we have to do is to identify what risk do we have. I mentioned that. We have also to protect, which we have to put in place all those necessary protections that are decided based on what we identified. And then we have to detect. Probably once everything is installed, if we agreed with vendor A or vendor B, even probably the vendor B who is starting from Brussels or who is building everything in Brussels may be at risk for whatever reason. He's purchased to the Russians, or I'm not giving any dumb examples now, or it's not secure anymore. Then we have to detect that there is an issue. And then we have to respond and we have to recover. All those facts, all those tasks are important tasks to put in place. I mean, we are building an infrastructure that is not going to be most probably replaced in the coming 5 to 10 years. So we are talking about infrastructure for the whole country. And I agree with you what to say, it is infrastructure for whole Europe, because one weakness in any European network will be weakness for Europe. So the question is, how can we ensure that whatever we are looking at, whatever solution we are building, is adequate from the different points of view, and not for a specific time in a year. Today, 2020, end of the year, we decide that we can define a category of high risk or low risk, or vendor or not reliable or more reliable, and that could be wiped out, this definition, next year or in 6 months' time. So the question is, what are we talking about? What are the real risk management activities that the country is doing on its own, unfortunately, and not Europe-wide, and how can we ensure that all those are put in place, not in the forms of definitions, but in the forms of real actions, because we are inventing a new practice today, but that practice, as I mentioned, exists for the last 35 years, if I may say, with all those mechanisms of identification, protection, detection. I mean, all those exist, and on the level of the 5G, on the level of whatever security we can imagine in relation to the different categories of security, we have to take our act together and put something in place to say we are governing adequately that risk. So for future generations, we can say that we have not only managed it well, but we documented it well. So the next generation or the next government will be building on our foundation of protection or on our foundation of governance that we put in place and go one step further. If we don't do it that way, and if we do it by what could seem as an improvised definition that may not last for more than 5 months or more, then we have a problem. Then the next generation that could be coming in 6 months or a new government in 3 years may have different opinion of the thing, and we can start again, and then good luck for all kinds of risks that at that time we cannot anymore avoid, because we would have had a population that is working for all that infrastructure that we couldn't stop anymore, and we would have created a tissue, an ecosystem that we cannot interrupt, whatever risk we have, similarly as what we have today with Facebook, with my family use of Facebook. I cannot stop that. And yes, yet we know that there are risks.
And if
okay, well, I'm going to, sorry.
No, I
yes.
just wanted to just also pick up on your question about the quantification of the cost and the, what it means for the economy, the consumer. If this would have been a real European regulatory proposal, it would have had to go through the motions of the best practices that the European Commission has set for itself with an impact assessment, etc. Unfortunately, you don't see that same type of best practices being applied at national level. And so if we were to come back to the Belgian situation, I don't think that any such quantification of the overall impact on the economy, on the technological developments, on prices has been made in relation to the proposal.
Okay, well, I'm going to invite you all to one by one give a sort of closing conclusion. I'm going to start with ladies first. I'll start with Shannon. Any thoughts?
My thought is a lot of is being made, and I presume it's due to the former, I am for my part happy to say, administration that is on its way out in the United States, but a lot is being made to sort of, I don't know, wish this away as a part of the trade war between the US and China. The struggles that the intelligence community in the United States are dealing with and trying to secure national security for my country did not start with that administration. They began before. I have a report, and I can send it to either to all of you, or you can download it from my LinkedIn profile. This is an evolution, a 30-year period where we've seen and questioned Huawei. It's only now that we as public, as members of the public, are starting to hear about it in the press, but there were these questions going back to the 90s and to the early 2000s. I don't know if you remember the company Nortel, the Canadian company that went bankrupt. It was quite a lavish company, and but it was on the front edge of 4G and 5G technology, and it was thought that this company would be the one leading the way, a Canadian company. It was found out, I think it was back in 2000, 2001, 2002, that a great deal of its technology, due to the neglect, generally speaking, by Nortel's own staff and engineers, but a great deal of its technology is considered to have been stolen by the Chinese. They the intelligence agencies, the Canadian Intelligence Agency had actually gone to Nortel and told them that, I think there's a quote that I have in one of my reports. They said, they're sucking your technology dry, right? So this is back in 2000. We've known about these things for many decades, but now it's coming up to the surface because I think everyone's attention is on China, and probably what happened with Hong Kong drew a lot of criticism and a lot more scrutiny than before. But all you have to do is really just review the history. And I think—
But are you actually suggesting that Huawei is stealing technology?
Sorry, what's the question?
Are you actually suggesting that Huawei is stealing technology?
Well, we know Huawei is stealing technology, whether it's the 5G technology or the 4G technology. No, we don't know that. But when you're talking about IP theft and trade secret theft, Huawei's being sued. It has been sued by 4 or 5 major US firms. There's Cisco, there's T-Mobile, there's Fujian, Quintel. I have to go through and see. There's a whole list of US firms, and there's a couple of people. There's a Portuguese inventor that has a lawsuit in Texas because he does business in Texas. So
but isn't this normal business? This isn't security or spying. I mean, stealing a commercial advantage is normal business practice.
And that's the issue. The issue is whether Huawei is a private in a firm or a public firm. And I think intelligence agencies, and especially those that belong to the Five Eyes, or Canada,
Five Eyes, yeah.
US, yes. I believe that they've all come to the conclusion that Huawei is pretty much it's an arm of the state. It's a privately managed arm of the state, which is why they are making the recommendations that they make. So,
Mike, do you have a final comment?
Yeah, Nortel. I commissioned one of the very first fully digital PABXs in Saudi Arabia back in 1983. The Nortel SL1. I know Nortel. I've just sketched the list here: Juniper, Cisco, Nortel, Hitachi, Nokia, Siemens, Ericsson. All names from the past, all significant names in 2003. We did some research for gigarouters back then, and funnily enough, there was this very small, squitty little company called Huawei that was making bits of junk that nobody took credibly. So very much zero to hero in less than 17 years, which was a little bit surprising. We didn't see it coming, and here they are now. I think using the security argument is rather a weak way to exclude Huawei from the competition for whatever reasons you may wish to take. If it was me, I would use their very presence to beat the other ones down in price, and then find endless reasons to exclude them. I mean, we've just mentioned fair business practice. There's no fairness in business. Business is unfair most of the time. And if it's felt that, for example, Nokia is the preferred bidder, or somebody else, or both, Nokia plus somebody else, and definitely not Huawei, there's loads of reasons you could exclude them. When you open the tenders, I can think of lots of reasons. Security just is politically, that just turns the flames up, in my view. I think politically this is a poor way to go, and I'm not convinced by the economic arguments. How much does equipment actually account for the cost in a mobile phone bill? And I'd suggest it's rather small. So I don't buy into the economic arguments in the least. I can understand the socioeconomic arguments for maintaining some kind of, let's call it, European technological capability. And that's, I think there's valid arguments there. Excluding Huawei on security grounds, maybe there's some reasons. I would just use economic grounds, at which point the Chinese have got nothing whatsoever to stand on. And I'll finish my comment there, which is a bit wild and windy, but there we are.
Thank you. Raquel, what's your final comments?
Yes, so I would like to add several points. So the first one is that I am more convinced by the security arguments, because as the EU cybersecurity strategy that has been released this week says, it's explicitly said that the European Union lacks, and the European Union member states lack collective situational awareness about cyber threats, and this has a strong link with 5G. And then one of the main points is, if you want to exclude a foreign company from being the provider of your 5G services, then you have to try to embrace European companies. And as Mike said, Nokia and Ericsson currently don't have the same level of capabilities, and they are not as cost effective as Huawei. But for example, in the case of the European Union, there are several initiatives which, even if they will be actually fully deployed by 2030 and we are still in 2020, it's true that there are several European companies, for example, the Spanish Telefonica, French Orange, Telecom Italy, Nokia, Ericsson, and Siemens from Germany. They are working together to try to improve their cross-border data governance instruments and try to implement 6G technologies. So we are talking about the future. But the point is, now if you want to exclude a foreign company, you have to provide compensatory mechanisms for the government and for the impact that this can have in terms of social public provisions. And the second my second point will be the fact that if Belgium, as a, let's say, small country in comparison to other European countries, like for example France or Germany or Poland, Belgium currently doesn't have an own national strong 5G supplier or technology company. So from that perspective, it's very important to try to rely and try to exchange ideas, data, and instruments with other neighbor countries. And for example, in that case, we see that the European Union is improving the Connecting Europe Facility 2, which is mainly focused on trying to step up these 5G capabilities. So we'll see what happens, but I am aware of the fact that if you want to exclude foreign companies, you have to compensate until the moment in which, perhaps in 2030, we will have 6 European companies working at once.
Thank you. Yvan, your final thoughts.
Thank you. I think that I find it a missed opportunity in the sense that there was here clearly scope for a European-wide intervention. There's no reason to consider that the security concern, whatever it may be, would be different in Luxembourg, Belgium, Netherlands, France, or Germany. We're not talking about town planning regulation here. The security concern, particularly if you approach it from the bottom-up approach we've been discussing today, is clearly one that would have had merits in a European-wide approach. With that, it would also have come with the best practices that are in place for European legislation. And it would also have been in line with what the European institutions have been trying to achieve in relation to the telecommunications industry over the last 20 years, where they have precisely been setting up a very strong approach, common approach, harmonized approach as to how you regulate the telecommunications industry. And it's unfortunate that has not been done here, and that leads to the current wide divergence of regulatory approaches across the European Union, including in Belgium.
Thank you. George, final comments.
Thank you. I think all what we heard in the last conclusions, we were talking about 3 different dimensions, if not more: the geopolitical one, the economic and dependencies one, and the technical security one. And I think all of them are important. And we should not confuse one with the other, and we should not bring argument for one by justifying it with the other, as we heard very well, using the security as a justification for the economic or the political. So I think it is important to address this issue adequately, talking about those different dimensions. And if one of them is more important, for example, geopolitical or economic or whatever, then we have to consider that as being the most important one and focus on it on one hand. On the other hand, what Yvan mentioned, I think it is essential that we use this opportunity. This will not be the first opportunity, and it was not the first, it will not be the last, to identify Europe-wide standards. We will be having an avalanche of products, infrastructure, technologies. We talk about IoT, we talk about big data, we talk about different domains of technology that are invading us, whatever we do. And for some of them, we have those political, geopolitical dimensions and technical security dimensions and others. So we have to find a common way, and we have those practices. We know we don't have to reinvent methods of counting. We don't have to invent methods to protect ourselves, because information security protection is the same whether we are talking about an iPhone or a large machine or one technology or the other technology. The issue is that let us use those tools and those methods that we have, improve them and build them as a platform on which we are building additional practices in order to be stronger, as we heard a few minutes ago.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. That's an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I'm sure it's going to continue over the next weeks and months. But thank you very much for your time. Good afternoon.
Thank you.